May 4th, 1945. The roads of western Czechoslovakia are trembling under the tracks of American Sherman tanks. General George Patton's Third Army is on the move, and they are moving with the ferocity of a force that knows the end is in sight. These are men who have fought their way across the beaches of France, breached the Rhine, and smashed through the heart of Bavaria. Now, they are a juggernaut of steel and gasoline, and they have one final, glittering prize within their grasp: Prague. The ancient capital, the industrial heart of Central Europe, lies just 50 miles to the east. In the context of a mechanized global war, 50 miles is nothing. It is a morning's drive. It is a mere 2-hour march for a motorized column. The road ahead is wide open. The spring air is filled not with the sound of resistance, but with the roar of American engines. And yet, piercing through that mechanical roar was a desperate signal. The Prague radio had begun broadcasting a message that would haunt the conscience of the West. Prague calling. Prague calling. Americans, come quickly. We are fighting the Germans. Please help us. The situation on the ground is surreal, bordering on the absurd. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military machine in history, is dissolving before Patton's eyes. German soldiers are not digging in to fight the Americans. They are streaming west by the thousands, desperate to throw down their weapons. They are terrified of the Red Army advancing from the east, and they view American captivity as their only salvation. Entire German divisions are practically begging to be captured by the US Army. And where are the Soviets? Marshal Ivan Konev's forces are still bogged down in the east, fighting through the rugged terrain of Slovakia, days away from the capital. The race is practically won before it has even started. The Americans have the fuel, they have the firepower, and they have an open door. The Czech resistance is already seizing control of the city, broadcasting urgent appeals for the Americans to close that final gap. But then, the unthinkable happens. As the spires of Prague seem almost visible on the horizon, the order comes down from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. It is a command that defies every instinct of a conquering army. It is a cold, bureaucratic wall erected in the middle of a battlefield. The order is simple: halt. Do not advance beyond the line of Pilsen. Do not take Prague. While General Patton rages in his command tent, staring at a map that makes no sense to a soldier's eye, a far deeper, darker drama is playing out hundreds of miles away. In London, Winston Churchill is pacing the halls of power, consumed by a terrifying vision of the future. He is frantically sending telegrams across the Atlantic, using every ounce of his fading influence to plead, to warn, and to beg. He sees what the American generals do not. He realizes that the war against Hitler is over, but the war for the soul of Europe is just beginning. On the other side of the channel, General Dwight D. Eisenhower remains unmoved. He is looking at a military map. Churchill is looking at a political one. This disconnect between two great allies is about to seal the fate of a nation. This is the story of why the West stopped 50 miles short of history, and why Churchill's desperate pleas were ignored, leaving a nation to trade one dictatorship for another for 41 long years. To understand why Eisenhower pulled the emergency brake at Pilsen, we have to look back just a few weeks earlier to the banks of the Elbe River, outside Berlin. The decision to halt before Prague was not an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a repetition of a pattern, a consistent philosophy that Eisenhower had already applied to the biggest prize of all, Berlin. In April, American forces had the German capital within their reach, but Eisenhower had deliberately stopped them, stepping aside to allow Marshal Zhukov and the Red Army to take the city. To Eisenhower, Berlin was merely a prestige objective. He argued that the future occupation zones of Germany had already been drawn on the map. Why, he reasoned, should a single American soldier die for territory that would simply be handed over to the Soviets once the shooting stopped? He viewed the war through the lens of a military accountant: maximize enemy destruction, minimize friendly casualties. To him, racing for a capital city was vanity, not strategy. Eisenhower wasn't confused or hesitant. He was executing a rigid military blueprint. He failed to grasp the terrifying reality that while he was playing a fair game by the old rules of military demarcation, Stalin had already begun to burn the rulebook entirely. To Ike, Prague was simply a repetition of the Berlin precedent, a trophy not worth a single American life because the diplomats had already traded the ground away at Yalta. When the opportunity to take Prague arose, the ghost of Berlin was still haunting the command rooms of the Supreme Headquarters. Eisenhower, applied the exact same logic. If Czechoslovakia was destined for the Soviet sphere of influence, spending American blood to capture it seemed criminally wasteful. He was fighting a war of logistics and casualty counts, unaware that he was stepping into a war of symbols and ideology. This rigid military logic was amplified by a massive vacuum in political leadership back in Washington. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the titan who had steered the alliance through the darkest years, had died on April 12, less than a month before the Prague crisis. Harry Truman was suddenly thrust into the Oval Office. He was inexperienced in foreign affairs, unaware of the complex personal dynamics between Roosevelt and Stalin, and frankly overwhelmed. In this moment of transition, Truman did what any uncertain leader would do. He deferred to the experts. He effectively handed the keys of U.S. foreign policy in Europe to his generals. The diplomat's voice was silenced by the soldier's command. But there was an even more profound force tying Eisenhower's hands, a weakness inherent to democracy itself when locked in a struggle with a dictatorship. The American public was exhausted. For years, families had watched their sons ship out to foreign shores. The pressure from the home front was deafening and singular. Bring the boys home. The American voter didn't care about the geopolitical alignment of Prague or the nuances of Central European borders. They wanted the dying to stop. They wanted the victory parade. Stalin faced no such pressure. He had no voters to please, no grieving mothers writing letters to congressmen that he had to read. He could spend the lives of his soldiers like currency to purchase territory and political leverage. This created a fatal asymmetry on the battlefield. The dictator was playing a long game for empire, willing to pay any price in blood. The democracy was playing a short game for survival, desperate to stop the bleeding. Eisenhower wasn't just commanded by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was commanded by the collective exhaustion of the American people. And in May 1945, that exhaustion dictated that no GI should die for a city that wasn't ours. While the rest of the Allied leadership was intoxicated by the scent of victory, Winston Churchill was sobering up to a terrifying reality. In the final days of the war, the British Prime Minister found himself in a position of agonizing isolation. He was no longer the equal partner of the Big Three. He was the junior member of a coalition dominated by the rising superpowers. To understand why Churchill was so haunted by the fate of Prague, we must look deeper than just cold geopolitical strategy. We have to look at the scar on his soul left by the year 1938. For Churchill, Czechoslovakia was never just another country on a map. It was the symbol of the West's greatest moral failure. 7 years earlier, at the infamous Munich conference, Britain and France had bartered away Czech sovereignty to Hitler in a futile, shameful attempt to buy peace for our time. Churchill, then a lonely voice in the wilderness, had called it a total and unmitigated defeat. Now, in 1945, he was driven by a burning need for atonement. He didn't just want to defeat Germany. He wanted to wash away the stain of Munich. He believed the West owed a profound debt of honor to the Czech people. In his mind, liberating Prague was the only way to right the terrible wrong of the past. If they failed now, the moral stain would be permanent. Driven by this potent mix of strategic fear and personal guilt, Churchill launched a desperate diplomatic offensive. It was a campaign not of bombs, but of telegrams. Between late April and early May, he bombarded Washington with messages that shifted from advisory to frantic. On April 30th, he sent a pivotal cable to President Truman. Abandoning diplomatic niceties for the cold language of realpolitik, he wrote, "There can be little doubt that the liberation of Prague and as much as possible of the territory of Western Czechoslovakia by your forces might make the whole difference to the post-war situation in Czechoslovakia and might well influence that in nearby countries." Churchill was trying to teach the Americans a lesson in high-stakes leverage. He was desperate to secure a bargaining chip. He knew that once the shooting stopped, the only currency Stalin respected was possession. If the West held Prague, they could trade it for guarantees of freedom in Poland or the Balkans. The climax of this tragic correspondence came on May 4th. With Patton's engines idling just hours from the city, Churchill bypassed the diplomatic channels and messaged Eisenhower directly. It was a communication that stripped away all pretense of authority. It was a plea. He wrote, "I am hoping that your plan does not inhibit you to advance to Prague. I shall be much obliged if you would let me know what your decisions are." In the diplomatic parlance of the time, this was Churchill on his knees. He was begging Eisenhower to recognize that the military objective and the political objective were one and the same. He was screaming that the war wasn't over just because the Germans were surrendering. But to Eisenhower, These telegrams were merely noise, political interference in a strictly military operation. The Supreme Commander filed the request away, sticking to his line on the map, leaving Churchill alone in London to watch his prophecy of a divided Europe come true. To find the real reason why Eisenhower turned a deaf ear to Churchill, we must look beyond the borders of Czechoslovakia to the other side of the globe. It is easy to forget that when Germany surrendered, the war was not over. The Empire of Japan was still fighting with suicidal ferocity. Looming over Washington was the terrifying prospect of Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Pentagon estimates were grim, predicting up to 1 million American casualties. This nightmare scenario dominated American strategic thinking. General Marshall and the Joint Chiefs had made one priority clear. The United States absolutely needed the Soviet Union to enter the war against Japan. They needed the Red Army to smash the Japanese forces in Manchuria to save American lives. This was the leverage Stalin held over the Western Allies. Eisenhower was operating under immense pressure to do nothing that might jeopardize the Soviet entry into the Pacific War. In the cold calculus of global warfare, Prague became a sacrificial pawn. Eisenhower was effectively trading the freedom of the Czech people for the lives of American GIs on the beaches of Japan. However, it is a myth to believe that the American government was united in this decision. The tragedy of 1945 was also a tragedy of ignored expertise within the United States itself. While President Truman, inexperienced and overwhelmed, deferred to his generals, a quiet but desperate battle was raging inside the State Department. Seasoned diplomats like Joseph Grew, Under-Secretary of State, and Averell Harriman, ambassador to Moscow, understood the Soviet mindset far better than the military establishment did. They were sounding the alarm loud and clear. Much like Churchill, they saw the reports coming out of liberated Poland and Romania, the arrests of democratic leaders, the suppression of the press, and the shadow of the secret police. Harriman famously warned Truman that the Soviets were not liberating nations but conquering them, creating a barbarian invasion of Europe. These diplomats argued that the military lines of today would become the political prisons of tomorrow. They urged Truman to reconsider the Halt order, arguing that Prague was the last remaining bridge to Eastern Europe. But in the spring of 1945, the soldier's voice drowned out the diplomat's warning. The Japan factor acted like a gravitational pull that skewed every decision. Truman chose the clean simplicity of Eisenhower's military logic over the messy, complex warnings of his own State Department. The experts were right, but the generals were in charge. Eisenhower, for his part, suffered from a dangerous political naivety. He trusted his personal relationship with Marshal Zhukov and believed Stalin's promises of free elections. He thought he was shaking hands with an ally. He didn't realize he was shaking hands with a rival who viewed every handshake as a tactical pause in a never-ending struggle. By the time the Americans realized that the spheres of influence were not temporary zones but permanent walls, it would be too late. While the diplomats in Washington and London argued over maps, the man who actually had the power to change history was pacing like a caged predator in his headquarters. General George S. Patton was a man built for momentum. His forces had just completed a staggering 600-mile dash across Europe, and by early May, the German resistance before him was not just crumbling, it was vanishing. German soldiers were streaming west, terrified of what the approaching Red Army would do to them. To Patton, the road to Prague was wide open. But on May 5th, the situation inside Prague descended into a nightmare. Believing that Patton's arrival was imminent, the citizens rose up. Resistance fighters stormed the radio station and threw up barricades. Inside the American tanks just 50 miles away, the radios were no longer silent. The pleas for help that had started days earlier were now turning into screams of agony. For the American GIs sitting on their hoods, forced to listen to the sounds of a massacre while their engines sat idle, it was torture. They heard the static, the gunfire, and the desperate voices of civilians begging for the tanks that would never come. Instead of help, the German SS units lashed out with the fury of a wounded beast. They turned heavy artillery on the city, using women and children as human shields to clear the barricades. In the midst of this chaos, one of the most bizarre and tragic subplots of the war unfolded: the story of the Russian Liberation Army, ROA, commanded by General Andrei Vlasov. These were Russian soldiers who had defected to fight for Hitler. Now, trapped between the crumbling Reich and the vengeance of Stalin, they made a final, desperate gamble. Vlasov's divisions turned their coats again and rolled into Prague, not to kill the Czechs, but to save them. For 2 critical days, It was these traitors, not the Allies, who fought the SS in the streets. They battled fiercely, hoping to earn the right to surrender to the Americans. They sent emissaries racing to the American lines, effectively offering Prague to Patton on a silver platter. But the American response was devastatingly bureaucratic. Bound by the Halt order, Eisenhower refused to grant them asylum. Realizing they were doomed, the Vlasov troops fled into the forests to face mass suicide or Soviet execution. The Czechs were left alone once again. Meanwhile, just 50 miles away in Pilsen, the atmosphere in the American camp was poisonous. Soldiers of the 16th Armored Division sat on the hoods of their tanks, forced to listen to the screams for help on the radio. At night, they stood on the hills and watched the horizon glow red from the fires of the Prague uprising. They were close enough to see the city burning, yet they were bound by a line on a map drawn by men thousands of miles away. Inside his headquarters, General Patton was apoplectic. His fury was deeply moral. Unlike Eisenhower, Patton harbored no illusions about the noble Soviet ally. He viewed the Red Army as a Mongol-like horde that would swallow Europe whole. He saw the Halt order as a betrayal of the very people they had come to liberate. He famously pleaded with General Omar Bradley on the phone, his voice trembling with rage. He even proposed a rogue plan. He begged Bradley to let him get lost, to pretend his communications had broken down so he could accidentally liberate Prague and ask for forgiveness later. But the order remained absolute: halt. To Patton, this was more than a tactical error. It was a message of weakness sent directly to Stalin. He argued that if the United States wouldn't even take a city they were already standing next to, they were signaling to Moscow that the West lacked the stomach for the future fight. As he watched the smoke rise over Prague, Patton realized with bitter clarity that the United States was winning the war but surrendering its honor. The silence of the American guns in those 4 days spoke louder than any barrage they had fired during the war. Finally, on May 9, 1945, the Red Army tanks rolled into Prague. The Soviet propaganda machine immediately spun the narrative that would suffocate the nation. The Soviet Union saved you, the West abandoned you. President Edvard Beneš returned from his exile in London, hoping to restore the democratic republic he had fought for. But he returned to a trap. Because Eisenhower had halted at Pilsen, Beneš had no leverage. He found himself governing a capital that was physically liberated but politically occupied. Churchill was not just angry at being bypassed. He was terrified by the silence falling over the territories already held by the Red Army. On May 12th, as the reality of Prague's occupation sank in, he sent a message to Truman. Almost a year before he would famously declare it to the world in 1946, he privately warned the president with a phrase that would define the next 40 years. An iron curtain is drawn down upon their front. We do not know what is going on behind. For 3 brief years, Beneš tried to maintain a fragile balance, but without the physical presence of the West, that balance was doomed. In February 1948, the trap snapped shut. The Communist Party, backed by the looming threat of the Red Army, staged a coup that forced Beneš to capitulate. The tragedy was personified in the death of Jan Masaryk, the foreign minister and son of the nation's founder. Masaryk was a man of the West, a man Churchill respected. On March 10, 1948, his body was found in the courtyard of the Foreign Ministry, beneath his bathroom window. The authorities called it suicide. The world knew better. History calls this the third defenestration of Prague. This was a dark, brutal nod to the city's turbulent past, where throwing political rivals out of windows was the traditional Czech way of starting a war. But this was more than murder. When Masaryk hit the ground, the window to the west was slammed shut and locked from the inside. The echoes of 1945 rang out again 20 years later, in 1968. When the Czech people tried to breathe free during the Prague Spring, dreaming of socialism with a human face, the response was brutal. Warsaw-packed tanks rolled down the same cobblestones to crush the reform movement. Those Soviet tanks were occupying that space because 23 years earlier, American tanks had been ordered to turn off their engines just 50 miles away. The prestige objective that Eisenhower dismissed as not worth an American life had become a fortress for a regime that would threaten the West for the duration of the Cold War. It would take 41 years, until the Velvet Revolution of 1989, for the people of Prague to finally reclaim the freedom that was within their grasp in 1945. The collapse of the Soviet Union finally allowed the ghost of the Halt order to rest, but the lesson of that order remains terrifyingly relevant today. The story of why the West lost Prague is ultimately a lesson in the danger of compartmentalization, the fatal belief that you can fight a war as a purely military exercise while ignoring the political landscape. Dwight D. Eisenhower won the tactical argument of 1945. He was a brilliant general who saved American lives and brought the boys home. But Winston Churchill won the historical argument. He understood that in the ruthless arena of global power, innocence is a luxury that free people cannot afford. He knew that a handshake with a dictator is meaningless unless your other hand is holding a gun. By prioritizing a clean end to the war over a strategic peace, the West learned a hard truth. The borders we fail to defend today become the front lines of tomorrow. To the very end, Churchill viewed the fate of Czechoslovakia as the ultimate litmus test for Western courage. His warning from 1945 was not just a plea for a city, it was a prophecy. And it serves as the perfect, haunting epitaph for this tragedy. Czechoslovakia is the most democratic, the most prosperous, and the best organized of the new states of Central Europe. If we allow her to be swallowed by a new tyranny, our victory will be but half a victory, and our honor will be stained for the second time in a decade. The Americans went home, the maps were drawn, and the honor was indeed stained. It is a reminder that while the decisions of war are made in an instant, their echoes and their costs can be felt for a lifetime.